Most people are aware of the existence of the Underground Railroad and understand how these connections helped runaway slaves escape the horrors of slavery. In 1793, the United States Congress passed the Fugitive Slave Act, which guaranteed fugitive slaves would be returned to their owners if they ran away. However, to the anger of the southern states, this was rarely enforced in the North, where slavery had already been abolished. In 1850, Congress passed another Fugitive Slave Act in order to appease the southern United States. This act allowed slave hunters to go into any state in the United States to capture those who had run away from slavery in the South. This law also stated that anyone who was found to be harboring or helping slaves in any way could be punished with a fine of up to $1,000 and 6 months imprisonment. This furthered the importance of the Underground Railroad, as slaves who had reached the free countries in the north of the United States could still potentially be caught and sent back to their owners. The only way to true freedom was to cross the border into Canada, where they would at last be safe. Many are unaware of the role the City of London, Ontario played in aiding slaves who were trying to break free from their bonds of slavery. Mainly because of its geographic location, London became a safe haven for runaway slaves. Border cities were still potentially dangerous locations, as some slave hunters captured slaves in places such as Windsor and Niagara Falls. Rarely did slave hunters attempt to capture slaves in inland towns, so once this obstacle was passed, the individuals were finally free. In Benjamin Drew's 1856 work, A North Side View of Slavery, he found that London had approximately 12,000 inhabitants, 350 of which were black. This was a substantial community for the time. Reverend Samuel Ward, in his autobiography, commented on how the black families in London lived in this same period. He wrote, "There are some families and individuals who are not only equal but superior to many of the inhabitants of whatever color. There is not a town in Canada where the respectable colored people enjoy more of the esteem of the best classes than London." He found that although there were many respected black men and women living in London, there was still among the lower classes racism and prejudices that existed. This was a trend seen in many Canadian cities, as the working class saw this group of laborers as threatening their own jobs. This is the setting for the founding of the Fugitive Slave Chapel, originally known as the African Methodist Episcopal Church. This form of Methodism began in cities such as New York, Philadelphia, and Baltimore in the early 19th century. Many of the original members belonged to the Methodist Episcopal congregations, but because of the racism they faced, they formed their own church, the African Methodist Episcopal Church, or AME. Congregations began to be established in other areas of the United States, including in some safe states in the South, such as South Carolina. One reason for its popularity amongst slaves was that the AME Church preached anti-slavery and anti-racism. With the numbers of former slaves rising in London, it is unsurprising that some decided to establish an AME church here. The land for the church, located at 275 Thames Street, was purchased on October 14, 1847. The trustees of the church purchased the land from William Clark for £22 and 2 shillings. The date of the construction of the building is not exactly known, but it has been said to be as early as 1848 and as late as 1852. The passing of the Second Fugitive Slave Act in 1850 made it a potentially dangerous situation if the members of the AME Church in Canada wanted to be a part of the annual American Conference. It was possible that they could be captured and forced into slavery. As they were already free in the eyes of the British government, the Canadian AME churches decided at their 1856 annual conference held in Chatham, Ontario, that they would become independent of the American Church and become the British Methodist Episcopal Church, or BME. This church played an important role for a large portion of the black community in London and therefore is significant. One important event that relates their history to the broader history of anti-slavery movements is the visit of John Brown, the famous abolitionist. He was in Canada in May of 1858, working in Chatham on his constitution of his proposed provisional government, but he would often visit London and Hamilton area in his time off. It is believed that Brown, while in London in the summer of 1858, visited the British Methodist Episcopal Church on Thames Street, most likely to try and gain supporters who would join himself and others in his planned revolt. In the early morning hours of October 17, 1859, John Brown and his supporters attacked Harper's Ferry. Brown believed the local population of slaves would join his revolt once it had begun. Instead, the United States Army took quick action and captured Brown. He was quickly tried and found guilty. He was hanged on December 2, 1859. There is not much documentation of what the chapel looked like originally. The first picture that is in existence is from the London Advertiser from 1926. However, thanks to its location beside the railway bridge and with the courthouse in the background, this chapel has been painted or mapped on several occasions. It is important to examine these in order to get a deeper understanding for the building itself. GIS maps are useful in order to contextualize older maps and place them in an appropriate geographic location. Here is a GIS map that demonstrates where the building is located and what surrounds it currently. The first of these maps is from 1861. It shows the dwellings that were located in London 20 years prior to the creation of the first fire insurance plans. This legend demonstrates what each point on the map means. The chapel is located here. From the symbol used, we know that it was originally a one-story wooden frame building. Here is the map again in GIS, placed on top of the modern-day map. Although the projection is a little off, we can tell which of the buildings it is. So we now know that while the chapel was still the British Methodist Episcopal Church, it was a small, one-story wooden frame building. But what did it look like? Next, we have a couple of drawings of the building to look at. The first is from 1848, which is titled, As London Looked in the Year 1848. We know it is from the same area, as in the description of the drawing it is written that the railway bridge over the Thames River had not been built yet, but if this drawing had been done 5 years later, it would have also appeared. The chapel would have been newly built, and is most likely one of these two buildings. However, the next two drawings help clarify which building it is exactly, as they were created several years later. The second is a bird's-eye view of the City of London from 1872. This map has a perfect view of the chapel property from this period. The chapel is most likely this building. Although the entire map is drawn as white buildings, if this building had indeed been painted white at this time, it would match the picture from the 1926 London Advertiser. We can also see that there are several other buildings on this block. The third image is again from the same direction. This one is a photograph from 1897 showing the Grand Trunk Railroad Bridge and the surrounding area. An arrow is used to demonstrate where the chapel is in this picture. By this time, the chapel would have been converted into a residence. Although the image is not clear, it is evident that the building was still indeed white, and most likely looks similar to the image in the London Advertiser. As there does not exist much documentation of this building specifically, these images are helpful in being able to understand what the building looked like and what the landscape surrounding the church was like in the 19th century. The congregation of the British Methodist Episcopal Church continued to grow in the 1850s and 1860s. To accommodate this growth, in 1869, a larger brick church was built at 430 Grace Street, where the church is still in existence today. The original church was sold as a residence to James Seal for $100. Over the next 130 years, this building changed hands many times. On August 11, 1986, a historic plaque was installed on the building to commemorate its importance and its history. It read, "The Fugitive Slave Chapel is one of two churches built by London's black community before 1855. In 1858, the abolitionist John Brown addressed a meeting here soliciting support for the movement which led to his raid on Harper's Ferry, Virginia, October 1859. However, at some point over the past few years, this plaque has been lost and it can no longer be seen on the building. In 2002, the building was sold to Jim Donnelly, the owner of About Town Cab Company. In March 2013, a request was put into the city for a demolition permit, as Donnelly wanted to use the land as a parking lot. A campaign began almost immediately in order to try and save this building. The hope is, if enough money is raised, the building will be picked up from its current location and moved to the property of the church at 430 Grace Street. This is why this information is so vital at this moment. Although the building is no longer looks as it did and has not been properly maintained over the years, it does not mean that this building should be simply demolished. If more people can identify and understand why this church was established in the first place, as a safe place and refuge for former slaves who had finally been given their freedom, then hopefully this building can be saved.